Hi. So when we talk about culture, what we're really talking about is stories about ourselves and about the society that we live in. And I keep thinking about Asia, and I keep saying that Asia is going to be the future. And one of the reasons is because in the United States, the stories that we've been telling ourselves have diverged so much from reality that we're now experiencing predictable divisions that result when you tell a story that is no longer true. And if you're a pessimist, a story that may never become true. And the story that we've told ourselves in America is that we are a diverse country that values diversity. And in fact, what we've really valued are, military coups that create refugees. And if they fail, military interventions or invasions that, if they fail, result in refugees and therefore immigrants and therefore differences. So in San Jose, California, a lot of the Vietnamese, in fact, almost all the Vietnamese immigrants here are the result of a failed invasion in Vietnam. You go to Miami, the Cubans there are people of Cuban descent, are the result of a failed coup in Cuba that the Fidel Castro fought off, and so on and so forth. Now, one of the reasons that the United States is also having difficulty maintaining an adequate storytelling function, and as a result is suffering cultural strife, is because most countries, no matter what the time period, that run on military spending and are therefore empires, have a predictable outcome. And it doesn't matter if you're Germany, you're able to win a lot of wars because at the time you are number one in math, science, engineering, and so on and so forth. You've got the U-boat, you've got all these other issues, and all these other innovations that make it difficult to counter expansion. It doesn't matter if you're the United States. Today, the outcome is predictable, and most human beings, I think, it's not that we like distraction, we just like a story where we don't know the ending. Because at least that gives us hope, it gives us optimism. And I don't think most human beings want a predictable story, at least not 100%. And so when you look at the United States, the story is becoming less a story of tolerance and more a story of differences. And Paul Theroux, who's a travel writer, he actually had the most astute comment on this phenomenon that I've read. He said that in America, because we've got so much elbow room, we have a lot of differences. And that those differences are often mistaken for tolerance. But they're not tolerance. We only tolerate differences in America where they don't interfere or they don't impact our lives. And that has been the consistent trajectory of society here. And one of the reasons why things don't seem to change. In other words, we can't seem to solve racism and so on and so forth. Whereas, of course, Singaporeans passed laws that prevented ethnic enclaves. We have a more free market system that works very well. It works very well when you're dealing with corporations and business expansion, but perhaps not so much when you're dealing with people who are less predictable. And you look at Europe, Europe, by the way, it's able to have perhaps a better story today, certainly not in the past, because despite being a colonizer, it was, you've got differences across the continent. You've got the British who've got the, Protestants and anti-Catholic Reformation that led to the Anglican Church. You've got the French that were anti-Catholic. They had a revolution that overhauled the Catholic legal system and Catholic influence. You've got the Spanish. The French took over from the Spanish, who were, of course, Spanish Catholics that colonized right here, where I am right now, the city called San Jose, which is a Spanish term. Up north is San Francisco, a Spanish word, and so on and so forth. And one of the oldest missions is right, nearby here, where I am. And the story, so you have this idea of perhaps an understandable story in Europe, but not necessarily a predictable one, because you still have a lot of differences, and it's not as if Europe obviously together, the EU together is quite vast. But, if you look at it, it's a bit more congested. It's more walkable just because, a lot of the buildings have been preserved. So if you go into a European city center, for the most part, whether it's in Slovenia, Ljubljana, or whether it's in Paris, a big city, you can still pretty much walk it. So the Europeans have had, perhaps because of constant conflict and expulsions and so on and so forth, and refugees, of course, many of whom came to the United States. One of the reasons that we have so many German immigrants is not only because of World War I and World War II, but because of essentially civil war, and it started in 1848 in Europe. Constant conflict. And the Europeans have successfully managed to at least overcome, or at least tell a better story than they did in the past. And if they hadn't, we wouldn't have the EU. So you can see that the Europeans' story, it's not necessarily as predictable as the United States. The countries, or the bloc, is not really run on military spending, and therefore is less predictable. You can't really compare that to the United States. If you try to find similarities in the United States, I guess you've got Quebec, right? You've got Canada, which is part of the Commonwealth. So but that's really it, right? You don't really have this idea of, of really tolerance for differences in any sort of non-segregated way. And that's, again, what happens when you have military spending, because you have a position or a situation where the military favors a single standard based on a hierarchy. And then if you go to, anywhere in the United States, you're going to see pretty much the same freeway, even the same city design. You've got your gas station, you've got your apartments, you've got your restaurant. It's all going to look fairly similar. Anywhere you go in the United States, whether it's, if it's a less affluent area, you're going to have your laundromat and your liquor stores. And everywhere we'll have a shopping mall. Whether it's a strip mall, an outdoor mall, or an indoor mall, they're all going to be quite similar. Because one of the problems with having a centralized system that the military favors and military spending favors is, of course, this idea that you're going to have differences, but not meaningful differences. And if there are going to be meaningful differences, just like in the military, we're going to flatten all of it so that we can control it and make it predictable. That's what the military does. That's the culture of the military. And once upon a time in this country, we had a Supreme Court justice that differentiated us from the Soviet Union proudly by saying that in this country, the United States, Justice Douglas, in this country, we are not like the Soviet Union. The civilians run the government. And you can see how, if you really have unchecked military spending through appropriations rather than in-budget spending, if you have that, then the civilian sector, the political sector, they're just sort of stand-ins to tell a story that most people over time won't believe anymore, because they will lack credibility, because they're not the ones who are really running the country. And of course, the military tends to be aligned with the banking system. That's not just an American phenomenon. Look at the British East India Company. Some private corporations or companies were taxing people in India on behalf of the Queen. I believe that was in Bengal. The expert on that would be a British academic. I can't pronounce his name. I believe it's William Dalrymple, Dary, and then you can probably try to fill out the rest by putting in India colonization expert and so on and so forth. Now, why am I optimistic about Asia? Because of course China has a centralized system. That's one of the reasons why it's managed to be somewhat successful. In fact, we'll say it has been successful up to now. So why am I more optimistic about Asia than I am about the United States? despite the fact that I'm complaining that the United States has become quite similar, quite the same, and has a predictable outcome, just like every other empire in the history of the world. And one of the reasons is because Asia has not managed to tell its stories well, at least not in the English language. The history of colonization has meant, when you're colonized, you don't get to tell your own story. Somebody else tells it for you. The capital is taken over, your politicians are taken over on a national level, and your policies shift to favoring international entities rather than domestic entities, especially if you have natural resources. So you look around and you ask yourself, what makes Asia more favorable climate? Well, again, number one, they haven't been able to tell their own stories up until now. And there are a lot of stories. You've got, just in China, you've got major differences between Sichuan province, Canton, you've got Hong Kong. Of course, Hong Kong is evidence of colonization. You've got Macau, Portuguese colonization rather than British colonization. Put all these things together, you've got, just within the country, you've got, this idea of a lot of diversity to the extent that you can tell the story properly. Because just think about it, it's intuitively, a country that big with so many people has to have diversity. It's just that we're not able to see it or think about it properly because our predilection for visual evidence or dependence prejudices us against perhaps a higher level of thinking. And of course, it's certainly true that people in China have different skin colors, different skin tones. It's just that they haven't been able to tell the story properly. And once they are able to tell the story properly in multiple languages, which will require more diplomacy, globally and otherwise, you're going to see an opportunity for China to become not just an economic leader, but perhaps an ideological leader. But of course, China has to be careful. One of the problems we've had here, and China is going to have a lot of advantages because it's able to study the United States. Usually when empires collapse and somebody else, or decline, and somebody else comes in and tries to attempt pole position, usually it's a revolution, right? It's a war. That's not going to happen overtly between China and the United States. That means that China can study the failures of the United States, and in doing so, avoid them. In the same way that Singapore was able to study, say, Ceylon, and avoid those problems. And China has already been smart enough to study Singapore, right? Shenzhen, the economic special zone, is based in part on Singapore and a Singaporean idea. So you have this idea that China may be able to avoid the problems of the United States, especially with social divisions. And if it wants to do that, if it wants to move into a leadership position from a cultural level, it has to be careful because it's seen what's happened to the United States. In other words, if you don't truly value tolerance, if all you have are differences that are manageable because of historic segregation, if you're able to avoid that, where do you go from there? There hasn't really been a template for an empire to study, at least not a sustainable one. The American model has not been sustainable. So China has a chance to invent a new, essentially cultural norm of trying to create its own stories in a way that allows the world and future generations some kind of template that allows a society where you have differences as well as elbow room, as well as tolerance. And the Singaporeans, again, China is very lucky because you've got Singapore to study as well. And of course, the examples are not going to be copy and paste. But again, you have a template, albeit a small, very small one, to go on. And what you notice about Singapore, they talk about sacrifices. They say that we've had to make a lot of sacrifices to be here. And the question really becomes, what sacrifices are the Chinese willing to make in order to move or progress from a society of differences into a society of tolerance? Is it going to, what levels of immigration are going to exist? Are we going to be able to bridge the history between Japan and China, and Japan and Korea, and China and Korea, in a way that is manageable, while at the same time dealing with an adversary, the United States, that is going to do everything it can to exploit differences between the Japanese and the Chinese? How are we, the Chinese, going to fix that issue and deal with it? Because it has to be dealt with. How are we going to do it in a way that's honest? If you look at it that way, the Chinese are now probably on the cusp of having an enviable position, but a difficult one. And that really is going to be China's challenge moving forward, is telling its own story, not just of itself, but of all of Southeast Asia, and how to do so in a way that is not only translatable, but empathetic. And of course, how to do so in a way that, unfortunately, is non-American. Not based on a false sense of tolerance that's based on military expansion, and in many cases failed military expansions, but really, really, truly based on genuine tolerance. If you look at all the empires in the history of the world, all of them have failed, probably because they couldn't answer this question. And China is in a unique position to be able to answer this question. And that is something it ought to focus on. And there is no 5-year plan for this, there's no 10-year plan for this, there's no 20-year plan for this, and there's no 30-year plan for this, because it is still unpredictable. But China probably should have a plan, because this might be the single greatest issue that it has to deal with.